A journey into the underground with Adam X. Sonic Room Podcast. Hello, everyone. I'm Adam X, and today I'm excited to sit down with one of the most visionary producers in the realm of electronic music, Robert Henke, also known as Monolake. Robert is a true pioneer, constantly pushing the boundaries of techno, not just through sound, but also presenting incredible audiovisual experiences in his live concert appearances. Moreover, his contributions to the development of Ableton software have greatly impacted countless producers, including myself. My own music over the past 20 years owes a great debt to his innovation and creativity. I'm absolutely honored to have him on the show today. Hello, my fellow podcasters. Today I have an interesting guest on the show, and I'm in his studio. It's Robert Henke of Monolake, and I'm very excited because I'm a huge fan of him. And I've probably seen him play live more than any other artist in my life. I've probably seen you play like 12 shows by now, going back to when you first came to New York for PS1 back in like, I guess, 2003. And I've seen many of your visual arts, music, audio, visual shows. And so thank you for having me over. And
Well, thanks, Adam, for talking to me. And hello, everybody.
Yeah, it's so Robert, when I was here recently hanging out with you and Suzanne, you told me that you're originally from Bavaria, and I never knew that. I never knew you were
Yeah.
Munich.
I'm
Cool.
from Munich. I'm from a boring, conservative, beautiful, and slightly annoying town.
Yeah, I always thought you were an East Berliner. I don't know. I guess it was the affiliation with Hardworks back in the day and Chain Reaction. I think it's probably easy that most people would probably think that. Yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
So what was it like growing up in Munich? I don't think that was probably a hotbed for music in the late 80s, before you were putting out records and
It was very much not. I was totally isolated. I mean, it's hard to imagine nowadays with the internet and everything. But back in the 80s, if you lived in a more suburban part of Munich, my access to interesting things was very limited. And amongst my friends, no one was interested in electronic music. And what I did was considered very strange. This was a time where music teachers were still discussing that drum computers are not musical instruments, stuff like that. So things really only changed when I moved to Berlin in 1990 and suddenly became part of this emerging electronic music techno scene. And that was really when it all clicked.
What were you listening to in Munich at that time? Was it like industrial music? Were you listening to punk? I'm sure knowing your music, you had to be listening to some counterculture music and not some pop German music. I can't imagine that.
I had good luck that I had an interesting physics teacher who exposed me to a few things. So via him, at least, I got listening to stuff like Eric Satie. So at least music and Steve Reich and Philip Glass and all the American minimalists. And I also discovered by myself Tangerine Dream because I saw a record cover full with electronic equipment and I thought, I need to have this record. And that was a huge influence too. And then, of course, I did listen to everything I could get my hands on in electronic music. But at this time, I had to go to a mainstream record shop to ask for stuff. And then, of course, I got Handel, Jean-Michel Jarre, and all that kind of things. So my access to interesting off-the-record music was very limited.
And what about dance stuff like, early Giorgio Moroder stuff and stuff?
Yeah, of course. I mean, disco and everything that is related, of course, made its way into my group of people. And then there was Joy Division, and then there was I forgot the name. But
were you doing the industrial EBM circuit like Front 242 and ISAB and stuff like that as well?
This stuff I really only discovered in Berlin. I mean, the only thing I was already aware of was Neubauten, of course. So that was stuff that was pop enough or mainstream enough to get recognized. And then, of course, everything that has to do with British synth pop I mean, like Fat Gadget,
DAF?
like that. Of course, yeah.
I mean, they're pretty minimal, right? Minimalist.
That was Duff was something where like, what the heck is that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, amazing stuff, right? And what about your introduction? I mean, I don't even know when the Acid House thing hit Munich and the early Detroit techno and all that. I don't know if it didn't even hit till later in the like very early 90s, if it was there in the late 80s at all.
I was not part of any scene in Munich, and therefore all of that completely left unnoticed.
So what made you move to Berlin? What was in Berlin that you like, I'm gonna leave Munich, I'm gonna find my way with music there? What was the exciting thing in Berlin that pulled you to Berlin?
It was not music. It was the fact that I felt that I didn't feel in as a person in Munich at all. It was enough to have slightly longer hair, which I had back in these days, and a small earring to be beaten up in the subway, because I didn't fit in. And I was in Berlin for the first time a few years earlier, together with my class. We had a class tour to Berlin, and to see East Berlin and the wall and everything like that. But what I noticed is there's people who look different. So it's really was very striking to me to see that I have no idea about Berlin, but something here tells me that this is a different place. And as soon as I could, I moved here. And suddenly I realized I'm not the one who is the most colorful, most outstanding person, because there's all these people who are much, much more radical than I will ever be. And I found great peace in that, because I thought, okay, I can do whatever I like in this city and no one will care in a negative way. And yeah, that's how it started.
I mean, there's a huge disparity between the way that both cities looked. I mean, I went to Munich in the mid-90s and I came here in the early 90s to play. And it was like a night and day difference. Munich was very colorful with all the old buildings and the Altbau buildings. And Berlin was just kind of
it was rough.
Or, if you got over by Kappelstor, there's a lot of like, I don't know, it's kind of weird because the buildings look very, very Eastern, but I mean, it was the West, but there's definitely an architecture that's kind of cold there. I wouldn't say it's really brutalistic, but kind of on the border, right?
It was super rundown. I mean, especially Kreuzberg, where we are now, which now is like this gentrified hipster area. 30 years ago, this was really dark. There were not many cafes and not many biological supermarkets and stuff like this. It was just very dark and very dirty and very rundown, but cheap.
I remember going to Kappelstor in '96 when I first came here, and I was like, wow, this is like as bad as New York. Like, but the Bowery was still rolling New York City. And then you had Kappelstor, which is still not really great by any means, but back then you had the heroin needle trucks that would distribute the needles, right? Because of AIDS and all that stuff going on. And it was a lot grimy. Like you said, there was no gentrification. I don't remember seeing any cafes. This kind of gentrification in cities didn't really even exist yet, And so you arrived here, and where did you first move? What neighborhood did you live in? What was your purpose here? Did you make music and have a studio right away? I know that you did mastering and went into that at some point here.
Yeah, but this was much later. I moved to Prenzlauer Berg, which was basically the center of East Berlin, or the hipper part of East Berlin, or actually more bohemian in a also rundown way. And I lived in a empty building where the whole top floor was empty, and you could just walk in there, and the building did belong in the East German times. Buildings did not belong to people but to the state, and a lot of the previous owners were people who were either killed in the Third Reich or had to leave Germany. So there was a lot of ownership which was completely unclear. And this was true both for buildings where people lived, but also for a lot of the industrial properties. And that meant that after the wall came down, when the state of the GDR didn't exist anymore, it was somehow completely undefined who these buildings belonged to. And they were just managed by a city management organization.
That's amazing. I never actually realized that.
So the the main idea of that organization was to keep the buildings in an okay state, but there was no commercial interest. And that meant that, for instance, I got my apartment there at Prenzlauer Berg, and the only agreement was that I have to build in new windows because there were no windows anymore, and I had to build a heating system. And for that investment, I could live there rent-free for 2 years. And so I did this, and afterwards the rent was still ridiculously cheap. So I lived there for 10 years till this neighborhood became really very gentrified and really boring as a result. And then I moved to Kreuzberg, where I'm now. And the interesting part about this property laws is that this not only allowed to squat houses and being relatively safe there, because it was very unlikely that someone got evicted as long as the owner were not defined. But it was also possible to find empty industrial spaces that were only secured kind of in a more, symbolic way. There was a small lock, but really a lock of the sort that you can with one little tool just open. And then you were standing in this vast empty industrial space, which the workers really just left from one day to the other. So on some tables, there were still papers and stuff and everything. And you could just think, where do we put the DJ? And this is how Tresor came to life, and a lot of the other clubs in Berlin. You looked at spaces that were empty, you went in and you decided this could be a nice place. And it didn't matter how long this would last because the investment was so low. The definition of a club, a techno club in that days was, okay, a small PA and some place where you can sell beer, and that's it.
Were there a lot of one-off parties that were just in different spots every weekend, or was it always just kind of in a venue that, even like a venue that you described, but that would be ongoing? Like in New York, we always had parties that were in different locations pretty much every weekend and not in the same place.
Well, since the places which we found were relatively safe, in terms of no one would bother, there was no need to have this nomadic life. So you could, if you found a place that you liked, you put in your lock, you fixed the door, and you stayed there for as long as possible, because then you could also invest a little bit and could put some decoration in or build some bar. So there was some people doing metal works, and there were people doing video stuff. And at some point, then when it became clear that it became too risky, then there was a deal with the city housing organization. And then very often the deal was, well, you can stay there until the previous owner has been figured out. So it was always clear that your club could end every day. So kind of with 1 week notice or 4 weeks notice or something like that. But within that framework, you could do a lot of cool stuff. And this is how a lot of the early clubs in Berlin just started.
How were the police here back then? Were they pretty laid back, or?
First of all, they were in East Berlin. A lot of the policemen were confused because they had to learn the West German laws, and also the mentality of the people were very different. In East Germany, which was a dictatorship more or less, getting involved with the police was potentially quite dangerous. In West Germany, with the police, it was annoying, but not nearly as potentially threatening as in East Germany. And therefore, of course, people with an East German background, a West German background, were less afraid. And I remember situations where police is basically coming in a club and they were not used to clubs. They were not used to the music. They were not used to the fact that there's people, lots of them, but just dancing. And they were also not used to drugs, of course, because there was no drug scene in East Germany in that way. And everyone was on ecstasy and was smiling and was friendly. So imagine a situation as a police person. You arrive in a dark place, there's brutally loud music, and everyone is dancing and everyone is grinning. The amount of cognitive dissonance that you could experience as a police person.
I think it was even stranger in New York because in the raves there was no alcohol. So you came into the party to see what was happening, and then they don't see any alcohol. They want to bust the party because people underage drinking. Was that a thing here? People were drinking in the parties, or were they
Yeah,
just on
but this was
ecstasy?
not a problem because drinking was okay.
Right, because you have the laws much younger here than it is.
Yeah. So, but very often police just left profoundly confused and said something like this. Yeah, but please turn it a little bit down. Yeah, and then they left again, and that was really funny. We had lots of experiences with police that were.
And the police, were they mixed up? Like the Western Berlin police mixed, once the wall came down, didn't they integrate the police
of course
department?
they did. But still in East Berlin, you had more East German police because they knew the streets better and everything. There was one ridiculous situation where on the night before the 1st of May, there was a traditional event in East Berlin where people just make big fires and celebrate. And they made a fire in a park in the middle of East Berlin at Prenzlauer Berg. And since the day after is 1st of May, which is the kind of traditional unions demonstrations, but turned into a very violent kind of political demonstration in West Berlin already in the 80s. Well, starting from the 80s, the 1st of May was kind of, okay, the punks are fighting the police and supermarkets were burned down. So it was quite violent. And now there was a situation that on May 30, on the night before, there was this fire in Prenzlauer Berg. And there was already all these police people from West Germany brought into Berlin to fight potential violence of the 1st of May. And then they got the information that it already started. But this information was completely false because it was really families with kids around a big fire. And the police didn't understand the situation at all. And the police were West German police. They had no idea about the street names and everything. And they arrived with their water cannons and everything and basically destroyed that very peaceful assembly of people. And at the same time were completely confused. So they had these big speakers on their military trucks and said, please everyone go into this direction. And then they said a completely wrong street name. So everyone was confused. And my notion of the interaction between police and us, or people like us back in the days, was confusion more than anything else.
And maybe you can describe what May Day is to the people, May Day in Berlin as it is, because I think it's quite different than everywhere else in the world on May Day. I mean, this is the only city where they really go, it's almost like tradition to have a riot with the police every year. I mean, maybe it's calmed down a little bit in the last years comparative to the past.
Yeah, it definitely escalated into something that I think it's really hard to describe to an external world. There is this traditional opposition between the militant left wing and the police. And 1st of May kind of turned into the symbolic day where a lot of militant and potentially violent left wing people were fighting against the police to some degree for at least understandable reasons in the background, but more often also simply because it's kind of an adventure playground. And that completely escalated and got out of hand over the years and had not much to do anymore with politics. It's really more about, okay, there's always latent aggressions somewhere in people, and this was a great opportunity to let this aggression out. In my opinion, it was not cool back in the days, and it's not cool retrospectively.
I mean, I got to see it firsthand maybe about 10, 12 years ago. I went to one and it was really popping off, and I was like, I think I'm going to get out of here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so back to Prenzlauer Berg. So you were living over there and you had this flat that you kind of basically had to rebuild yourself? Did you put a studio in it?
Well, I mean, I removed the walls. I had one big room, and this one big room was my living room, my bedroom, and my studio and my kitchen in one slightly larger room, and that was it.
And what kind of music were you making at this time? It was more on the experimental stuff, or you were starting to get into techno at this point?
I started with kind of experimental drone things. And I also made music for an installation that ran. I was studying at this time. I moved from studying computer science to studying sound engineering at a film school. And in the film school, for an event, I created a sound installation with multiple loudspeakers all over the stairways of the school building. And I used a lot of transformed water samples and field recordings and drones. And I made a recording of that. And at this point, I had a few connections to the BDSM heterosexual, more or less, scene in Hamburg. And a friend of mine wanted to get in a ritual situation a piercing. And he was listening to this music at my place. And he said, "This is the music I want to hear during that ritual." And I said, "Sounds like a great idea." So I went to Hamburg with him, and as part of that play party where he got his piercing, this music was running. And afterwards, I got a lot of people asking me about the music. And I said, "Well, it's just some stuff I made." And then I turned this into a longer recording, and I thought I release it by myself. And at this time, I already had connections via some friends with the Basic Channel folks, with Mark and Moritz. And they just founded this kind of experimental sub-label called Imbalance Recordings, where they released a recording that is just 5 long drones from a friend of mine, Wieland Samulak. And so, long story short, they released as a second release this soundtrack that I made. And this then became my first CD, piercing music. And hence the title. The music itself is not very piercing, but it was used for that ritual.
So piercing not in the highs, but piercing
in what it was being used for, yes.
Or in other places, right?
That's yeah. Right. And that was kind of fun. And so once I got in touch with them, and at this time I was already making music with Gerhard. So we were experimenting, and because we used to hang out a lot, and we were at night going to clubs and went to Tresor and to all these places back in the days. And we also did hang out at the electronic studio of the Technical University, which was more a place for academic computer music, where we learned about Xenakis.
That's also in Berlin?
Yes, yeah. And so we were both exposed to club music on one side and to this kind of computer music from more academic background on the other side. And we started exploring our own ideas with the limited tools we had. He had a small Ensoniq sampler. I had my Juno 6 and my SY77, this one here. And we just did some stuff together. And we ended up doing a track that also got released on Chain Reaction, Cyan. And the rest is history.
So would you consider yourself a techno raver back in the day? You would go to clubs and you were into, the harder edge techno that was being played in that time period in the 94, 95?
I was into everything.
Cool.
I mean, I was just absorbing whatever I could absorb. So we went to techno places. We went to Gabba nights at the bunker here.
Wow.
And then we went to the Technical University to listen to John Chowning and Francois Bale and Xenakis. And then we went to, starting from the mid-90s, to all the drum and bass and jungle nights in Berlin. And so we were just taking in whatever was there to take in.
And when did you start doing the mastering? That was around that time, right? Like 95, 96 with Scion?
96, I think, yeah. So the story was that Mark and Moritz bought a record cutting machine, mainly with this idea that they took from Detroit to do everything by themselves.
What kind of machine was it?
A Neumann VMS 70, which they found somewhere in a very good shape. And really the idea at the beginning was they just do it to cut their own dubplates and their own stuff. But of course, people started to know. So they got requests from people from Detroit inclusive and other people who were associated with them. But it became very clear, very quick that they couldn't do it alone, just time-wise. So they, a friend of mine, Andy Melvik of Puerto Rix, he was the first engineer. And it became then very quickly clear that one engineer is not enough. So I became the second engineer. And I stayed there for, I don't know, 3 years maybe.
So you were actually doing the cuts and everything?
I did the cuts and the mastering, and I learned a lot. And I listened to a lot of music, of course, also as part of that job. And that was fun.
Who taught you how to do that? I mean, it's definitely pretty time consuming to learn not to blow the heads out on the machine, right?
I studied sound engineering, so I knew all the tools. So I knew the compressors and the limiters and the EQs and all that stuff. So that was not a big deal. And learning about the specifics of the machine was something that, learning by doing and be careful. And of course, we all knew that blowing a head is a problem and very expensive. But the Neumann machine has this nice limiter, and you can see the temperature. And if you're cutting high frequencies, then the temperature goes up. So if you cut a record that was really like lots of open hi-hats, then you were looking at the meter, and then the meter goes this, and we are getting too far, and then you're reducing the high frequencies a little bit. By nowadays standards, what we did back there was so rough, during the cutting, looking at the high frequencies, a bit down. So there was some life on the records that by nowadays standards, you would say, hey, what the heck is going on? Where's my high frequencies gone? So for the first two bars, it's all over the place. And then the high frequencies go down because someone is lowering the limiter while cutting.
And you had to put a lot of trust in the master engineer back in the day. It's not like now where you make music and then you have somebody digitally mastered and then they make a vinyl ready file that you can send to the cutter, and then you just tell the cutter to cut it flat, so they don't have really much control other than cutting the file as is. Back in the day, you would send a DAT to, like Dubplates and Mastering or whoever, NSC in Detroit, whatever, and you would be really in control of what it sounds like. Most people didn't. If they didn't slightly like it a little bit, they had to go with it because it was too much to recut it. It cost too much.
What is also important to understand is back in the days, a lot of fantastic music has been produced in crazy environments with shitty speakers and bad mixers and everything. If you're now on social media, sometimes people posting pictures of their studios in the 90s, and they look all exactly like my place. No acoustic treatment, shitty hi-fi speakers, a very bad small mixer, no cool outboard equipment, and not even thinking about Pro Tools or something like this. So the stuff we got in for mastering most of the time was in such a bad shape that you had to EQ like crazy. You had to boost some frequencies a lot and remove other frequencies a lot, and basically make a decision by yourself that really that snare needs to be 6 dB louder, and that hi-hat, oh my God, what's going on here? So it was completely normal to do drastic changes to the stuff. And of course, compress it like hell because it was not compressed at all.
Yeah, nobody was compressing really music back then.
So the expectation was that when you get your record back, that it sounds completely different than what you gave. So that was the expectation.
But the thing was that you couldn't even really A and B it because you get the record back and then you gave the DAT. Sometimes if you didn't have two DAT machines, that was the only DAT, right? Like that's happened on some old stuff of mine in the 90s that those DATs are missing. They went to the cutter and never got them back or whatever. And you couldn't really do an A/B test with the DAT versus the vinyl. So a lot of times when you heard the vinyl, you weren't even sure. You're like, like you had no way to really check it. Like now, like I'll use Ableton, for instance. I'll take a pre-master and then the master, and I'll go in and out. I'll solo in and out, line them up, and hear every little intricacy that might be either to my liking or not to my liking. But then you couldn't do that back then.
As I said, the whole situation was much rougher. It was also the high time of techno in terms of producing. So we had labels that were sending us masters, and obviously they didn't listen to the masters once because we got the DAT tape. So we play it, and after 3 minutes, the left channel is off, like bang, gone. And so there you can be pretty sure that this is not intentional. So you call the label, and the label says, "Oh, really?" I tell the artist, they haven't been listening to it once. So it was a crazy time.
And then there was people like me. At one time, Christian from DMM, when he was working there years ago, he was doing the traversable wormhole stuff. And I didn't realize that with vinyl that some of the frequencies were really pretty low, like 35 hertz. And he's just like, this is a little bit low, and you shouldn't really go this low. And I'm like, just do it, because I've been playing it out and it sounds super good. And he did it, and it actually worked on some sound systems, but then other systems really cut off at 40 hertz, right? Yeah. So it was because I think with vinyl, how low can you really go with it, or with the needle in the cut without blowing the head?
The problem is not the blowing the head. The problem is that in order to track the trace, what you want is that the needle is moving for the high frequencies, but for the low frequencies, the whole tone arm has to move. So there's two movements in one system, and you separate these movements by the frequency. So you say that everything below, 25, 30 hertz is the movement of the tone arm, and everything above is the movement of the needle. And you cannot separate this like brutally hard. So you have this lots of crossover where at some point the low frequencies on the record gets lower, gets less loud and less loud and less loud, and then the movement of the tone arm starts. And this is different for each cartridge, it's different for each turntable. And this is why you say, okay, to be on the safe side, you cut at maybe 40 hertz or something like this. Some turntables with some cartridges might able to trace stuff down to 20 hertz, others might not. So it's not so easy to foresee.
But I used to see some records where the grooves, like they have like really low bass, and the needle would jump a bit, like it was like a bad cut, of course, right?
Exactly.
And so when do you start getting in that zone where that's going to be a problem? At what hertz range is that?
Well, this depends on the tone arm and the cartridge, so you cannot predict it.
You can't predict it at all. So interesting stuff. I've always been curious with that about the cutting. I've talked to some engineers about it in the past. Did you enjoy cutting the records? Because I'm sure there's a lot of music you were like, what the hell is this shit?
Most of it we always enjoyed. We were of course talking, me and my colleagues there, we were of course talking about the music and the stuff. And sometimes, when one shift ends and the next shift starts, you still, for the test cuts, you use these big plates, and you have these test cuts on them, like a few minutes. And so there's lots of empty space. You cut basically what's on the space that is left over, and therefore you're also listening to what has been cut before. And sometimes you jump into something that your colleague has been mastering, and I think, oh, this is harsh, or oh, wow, this is cool stuff. What is it? And then you look up the catalog number. Oh, this is these people. Nice. So you had everything from music where you think, yeah, good luck selling that stuff, to, wow, this is really nice. So,
and what's the biggest record that you've ever cut that was, like the hit back in the day that you take pride? You're like, hey, you know what? I cut this record. They sold 100,000 copies. Is there anything that you can think of the top of your head?
No, I cut so much stuff. I I cut a few records that were from bigger names, but most of the time then not really techno, but other people who heard about Basic Channel having cutting studios. So I did cut some hip hoppers and stuff like that, and I'm pretty sure they sold much more than techno records. I
Did you cut your own records?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
When's the last time you cut one of your own records?
Maybe the year 2000 or a bit earlier.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you were pretty much out. You got out of the cutting thing before.
Yeah, I got out.
Millennium, right?
I mean, I have to admit, I'm a difficult employee, and I at some point I just didn't feel comfortable anymore. Working on other people's stuff and getting told what to do. And
well, now you had Monolake going on, and you started that with Gearhard, right? And then that's happening. And were you guys actually going?
But that didn't pay the bills.
Were you guys going out and playing live at this time? And
yeah, we did.
Some shows and stuff. And you did. I guess you did like 3 records on Chain Reaction to the '90s, right? And then the Hong Kong album.
We did a few 12 inches, 3, 4, 5, something like that, and then we did the album, and then on the next album we did something very different. And Mark and Moritz were more like, "What is that?" Like the Interstate album, which I personally still think is fantastic. But it didn't feel in the idea of rhythmically, harmonically, everything. It didn't fit in the Chain Reaction Basic Channel catalog. And this is when I started my own label, and I'm very happy I did that, I have to say, because it gave me the independence that I'm so much enjoying these days, where I just do what I like and when I like it.
Yeah, because I think Chain Reaction definitely had like a certain sound, right? And I think if you went too far out of that, it would not probably fit.
Yes, right? I think in retrospective, I completely understand that they didn't take it, but it was good for me. So that.
What did you consider the style of music at that time? It wasn't really dub techno, but it kind of was. It was like it was on the fringe of it, right? I mean, but it's not really
Basic Channel Chain Reaction techno. It was dub influenced techno. Yeah.
Yeah, you had a little bit more. It was slightly different. I can't really say, is it dub? Would you consider it dub? It was, I guess.
Well, I mean, of course, there's Mark has a strong dub reggae affiliation. Moritz, I think, less so. And me and Gerhard definitely not. So our influence was more secondary. We completely enjoyed everything that Basic Channel did. So, but we enjoyed a lot of different types of music. So, especially then when it became big, the jungle and early drum and bass. So that was something which had a huge impact on us. And I believe that Interstate in some way is a weird merge of some of the techno influences that we had, plus the sound aesthetics from early drum and bass, and plus our own madness. And yeah, this didn't work on the dance floor, and this didn't fit in the Basic Channel catalog.
And so before there was Ableton.
That was before Ableton.
No, I know. Before there was Ableton, what was your sequencer of your sequencer of choice at that time?
Gerhard discovered already in the early 1990s this software called Max, which is a tool for building your own music software. And we used Max to write our own sequences. And they were very primitive, but special. So primitive in a way that, for instance, it was a step sequencer we wrote, and that step sequencer allowed us to switch patterns, but we could switch patterns for each instrument independently. So instead of having one pattern that is bass drum, snare, hi-hats, whatever, bass drum was a pattern, the hi-hat was a pattern, and the snare was a pattern, and maybe a bass line was another pattern. And I could switch the bass line but keep everything else running, or I could switch the bass drum while everything else is running. And the sequencer had a few more interesting features that I could say, this note is only playing every third time, every fourth time, or something like this. And it was in comparison to a 808, that was a very advanced sequencer, but it was still a step sequencer. And we used the step sequencer to just trigger hardware synthesizers and basically adding a lot of effects and mixing them and recording it all to a DAT tape in stereo. And then afterwards, we were editing it down to the final track.
So you weren't using like an ADAT machine back in the day?
No.
To do editing.
We skipped directly from there to multi-track.
And computer-wise, you were using, I guess, a Macintosh, right, back in the day for this?
It was a Mac, yeah.
It was a Mac.
And before that, I had an Atari on which I ran Notator, like the software that later became Logic. But I didn't do much with that because working with Macs was more interesting to me.
So before that, you never used like MPCs or anything like MPC 60s?
No, Gerhard used to have a Studio 440, which was the sequential, basically offering for MPC type of music. But I never was a fan of the Studio 440 because I thought it doesn't sound good. Also, a lot of other artists used it to great success. I mean, a lot of the Traktor, Thorsten's stuff, Traktor is all Studio 440, for instance. And Traktor sounds objectively awesome. But I never got into that specific sound.
And then Ableton first came out. When did Ableton come around?
The company was founded in 1999. And we worked for the first half a year at least. The developers worked on all the framework stuff in the background, so not even something to see, but the audio engine to make sure we can play back audio tracks and we can time stretch them and all the stuff you need. And the first version that was ready to be shown, we showed at the NAMM show in January or February 2001. And soon after, we had the public release.
So Ableton 1 came out. And how did that go with the people out there? I mean, you had Cubase, who's the big thing in Logic at the time, right? And I mean, I didn't use either of them, to be honest with you. I didn't like those sequences, so I just stuck with using an MPC 2000 XL. And when I finally got into Ableton, I got it at 4. I think it was in 2003. I mean, it just revolutionized the way I make music. Since then, I don't have any of this anymore. I got rid of all of it. I sold it all. Regrettably, I got rid of my 909 and I got $700 for it when I moved here in 2007.
Yeah, well,
what with the 808?
Well, the idea was never to build a DAW. You know, we were, when you start something like this, you build stuff for yourself. So we were confident that there's enough techno heads or people who have a similar thinking, who have no clue about music in theory but want to do stuff. So we thought this is a product for a niche market, and we were confident enough that it's cool for enough people so that a small company, like 5, 6, 7, 10 people could survive. That was the goal, to make this tiny, small company survive. And we were really, really surprised when it started to grow that much. And when we realized that there's people interested in this product that we never thought would be interested. I mean, this is the story that I tell everyone, but it's a remarkable story. So at the first NAMM show, we had this tiny, tiny, small booth at the end of this hall where all the nerds were. So really off the main road and within the nerdy part at the last corner. And of course, we had not many people showing up, and we explained them what we're doing, and some people nodded, most people didn't get it. But there was definitely not much attention. And then at some point, a person came by, kind of an older guy, older-ish. I mean, we were in 30, so this guy was older, maybe he was 50. And he had a couple of younger people who came with him, but it was clear that he is the leader of the pack. And he came there and he asked me what this is about. And I explained it to him. And he said, wait a moment. So you can use a drum loop here and you can change the tempo without the pitch from what to what? And I say, well, from 20 BPM to however fast you want it. I can show this to you and I can draw an automation curve. And then I took a stupid drum loop and showed it to him. And then he said, and how, if I use Pro Tools, how can I work with that? And I said, well, we have Rewire. And Rewire was the standard at this time, which allowed to use Live, for instance, together with Pro Tools and sync it. And since we never thought of building a DAW, it was very important for us to have this, because we always thought of, for a more serious usage, you combine Live with one of the big DAWs, like Pro Tools. And then this guy was like, cool. Do you have some information? And I handed him over some papers. And then he left. And half an hour later, people came. People came and they always had the same introduction. Hans said that you have something cool here. What is it about? Other person came. Hans Zimmer said I should have a look at this. So basically, I talked with Hans Zimmer all the time, and I only saw that it was Hans Zimmer because they have these labels. Every exhibitor and every visitor had a kind of a their pass. But I was so busy with explaining the software that I didn't look at this. Only when he left, I noticed it. So when Hans Zimmer was interested, then it became clear to me and to Gerhard and to a few other people, maybe this is bigger than we think. And then we got people from very different contexts. We got theater people who previously were using really, really expensive custom software for triggering sounds in a theater. And of course, Live could do this easily for a fraction of the cost and with much more comfort and all these kind of things. So, yeah, we realized it's bigger than we think. And then we had always the fear for several years that the competitors will just copy it. Because, at the beginning we were a small company and the product was not that complex. So a company like Apple or Yamaha or Roland, if they would have seen this as a big thing, within 3 months they could do the same thing,
But isn't there a patent to that? The way it was laid out? I mean, it was very unique compared to all the other software, so anybody could just take it, and there's got to be some copyright laws.
No.
Okay.
Not really.
And so how did this change from you making music? I mean, for me personally, I went from having a studio like this where I would always have to work on that one track for weeks till I got it the way I wanted it. Don't touch the mixing desk, don't touch the keyboard.
Yeah.
To now I could actually make music in the box, right? I didn't have mixing desk bleed throughs and stuff like this. The channels were nice and clean. It just completely revolutionized the way I made music and how much faster I could not make music per track, but I could go to something and then work on something halfway and then stop, save it, then work on something else. And like, even till now, when I work on an album or something, I can work on 7 tracks simultaneously. 1 hour on one, 1 hour on the other. Was this the same for you?
Well, I did, of course, a radical step at some point and said, I only use Live. So all the equipment went into boxes in storage. And at this time, I had my studio still somewhere in one of those affordable buildings in the middle of nowhere in the city. And I got rid of it, and I had my laptop at home and 2 speakers, and I thought this is the future, of course. But then I missed having this kind of more haptic, intuitive access. So I step by step brought my equipment back, and then at some point I decided I need a studio again, and well, here it is. So
So
But
you like getting up and moving around. I'm more of a sit in the desk, nerding out, just total
it's
control of the operation and without having to move.
I like that. I think I like machines in general. I have a very personal relationship to all that stuff here, and it gives me inspiration if I play with it. It's not that I couldn't do it in software, but if I touch these machines and not looking at the screen and just hit record in live, what I'm doing very often is I just hit record and I play stuff and experiment and I see what's coming out. And most of it I never use, but sometimes something happens there where I think, hey, this could be a new piece. And then, of course, all the fine tuning and all the editing and making the beats right and everything that happens in live. I don't need all that stuff. At the end of the day, it's exactly as you said. I work on 10 tracks at the same time, and all in live. And I just use these things as sample sources.
So are you using any plugins still as far as like synths when you're making music, or is it just
Rarely, no. I mean, I use, of course, the Ableton standard stuff like Operator, which just turned 20. And
I had that in the first version.
Yeah.
Version, I mean.
Yeah. And I'm very happy still with Operator. I use the built-in sampler and all the effects, but I rarely use a VST plugin. And I'd rather use the stuff here and just record things.
I mean, it was an interesting changeover when the millennium happened, and then in the next years, maybe it started more in like 2003, 4, when this minimal and tech house thing got really big. And then you could just hear that almost everybody was making music with the Ableton. It was like, it just had a newer, more futurism sound at that time than the music from the 90s at that point.
Well, I think the big thing we, of course, solved is that once you are in the workstation, you don't have the issues with MIDI timing anymore. And if you want to, you can have your stuff super tight. And if I listen to my music from before the live days, where I was, for instance, using my Max sequencer, which had at this time really bad timing, I didn't hear these timing issues back in the days because my ears were so used to it. If I hear it now, I think, wow, this is so wobbly. And then comes the production I did in live where everything is really in sync and it sounds different. But it also kind of led to an aesthetic for a lot of people where it's become very blockwise. Like this one, this one, this one, this one. And the stuff I did before using live was much more organic. And it took me almost 2 decades to get back to a mental state where I can do these really nice organic things again, but with the precision and the control I have in software now. But I still like the fact that if I have a mixing desk here and I just move this fader and stuff is happening. It's nice. And I turn a switch here. And new things happen. And, I record these things and then I do the micro editing for weeks.
You could do that with a MIDI control, though, no?
This is premium.
I debate some friends with that often.
This is too old. There's no MIDI for those ones.
I like giving people shit sometimes. With it. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely fun when you have synths in your turn and stuff. I'm just lazy. I don't want to get up. I like to sit in front of my computer and just zone in.
Fair enough.
It's never really changed because I felt like the minute Ableton came in the picture, I made the music I wanted to make. Where before I was never really content with what I was doing. And maybe it's a bit of being a perfectionist and it helps you be I'm never perfect, but it makes me feel like I can get a little bit closer to perfection than the other way.
Maybe, but maybe also my problem is that I spend so much time in front of a screen also when not making music, like for my work for Ableton, for instance, that sometimes I really, when I'm making music, the last thing I want to do is look in a screen. And then I'm happy if I can just play around here, not even with the idea of recording anything or not even with the idea of turning it into a track. Just, I'm tired, but I'm not tired enough to go to bed. So I go here and I turn on the machines and I just play with them. And sometimes something comes up where I think, oh, I need to record this. Most of the time it's just like, yeah, it's nice. And then I turn it off and cool.
Yeah, I would say probably like in the teen decade, in the early part, that's when the music started going a bit back into hardware. You had people like All Rose doing, using more of this kind of modular droney sound. I don't know if he was using modulars to make this, but it had this kind of droney sound that wasn't really something you could get. You could get it out of Ableton, but I think it was definitely more organic coming out, and a lot of people started going in this direction, and then this whole modular thing blew up, which even you have a nice modular rack going on up there.
Yeah, a small one. I had more of that stuff, but honestly, for me personally, the ratio between what it costs and what I get out of it is questionable. So I reduced it to some modules I'm using a lot. But I think either you do stuff in your modular world completely and then it makes sense, or you do some really focused things like I do, and then a small system is just enough. There's a few filters, a few oscillators, and mainly what I'm doing with that one is there's the Lindrum below it, and it has a trigger output. So I sequence some drums, and one of the drums is not a old 8-bit sample, but a sound from the modular system. So, bass drum, snare, hi-hat, and then some kind of interesting low bass and stuff like that. Very, very simple, very old school in a way.
And so here we are in 2024, almost going into 2025, and this AI thing is really blowing up a bit, right? With the music and the last time I was here, you were showing me this how everything you can separate.
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
mind blown by this. I still am, and I can't wait to I can't wait to use it, and I gotta delve into that because that's just amazing just for DJing and just making edits of old tracks or things that I don't like that I like a track but I don't like a part of it or something. I was like mind blown. So there's this one part with the AI where, everybody's worried that anybody's going to be able to make music and just say, oh, I want a combination of Monolake with Jeff Mills with, something else. And then, Kraftwerk, right? And it's going to make it. And the person didn't even actually make it. The AI made it. But then there's this other part where people that actually make music and are super creative are going to be able to use this in ways that we've never seen before. Do you think, being that techno seems to always kind of be stuck in a loop a bit, right? It goes in a cyclical loop. Kind of waiting for something I've never heard before to come out. It's been a while to where there's something so fresh and new. Do you think we're going to see something? I mean, not see, but we're going to hear something really exciting in the next years, like the next year or two?
You never know. I mean, now we have a new technology, but so far, people are spending still time to understand what they can do. And since the AI in the image world is a bit older, you can already clearly see that there are some people who are doing really interesting things and who start to understand how they can use these tools in such a way that something personal comes out of it. So they're doing stuff that is less obvious than the stuff that you saw at the beginning. And they develop their style and their themes and their colors and all these kind of things. So what happens is that the tool starts to disappear a bit. And what becomes more visible is the personal style. And I believe exactly the same thing will happen with AI in music. At the beginning, which we are now, people use these tools like Audiovisual and all the other upcoming tools where you type in a prompt and you get out a sound file. And they get out the usual mix of things that you come up with at the beginning. And the more experience people have, the more they work with it, the more they will find out how to push things in such a way that the results are more personal. Like by taking a result, manipulating this result with other tools like Live or whatever, giving it back, say, this is the basis, change something based on that thing. So I'm confident that we're going to hear cool new stuff. just as we see cool new things.
So don't push the panic red button like, oh no, we're going to get destroyed. I mean, the only thing that I get worried about is it's so already oversaturated with music everywhere. It's so hard to follow music, especially in techno and in electronic music in general. There's just so many releases and you feel like you're missing stuff that's out there. Even when you're listening to music, it's just infinite at this point. It's not like when I first got into techno in 1990, you knew everything that was out. You could follow the music really easily. It's impossible to do that now.
Yes. And I have no idea about how to solve that. I mean, I just accept the fact that I only get to know a tiny fraction of what's out there. And I just hope that when I go to a festival or when I listen to stuff that people show me on social media, that this is the cool stuff. And sometimes I discover new artists where I think, oh, this is interesting what they're doing. So for me personally, it's not that different from the old days. And most of the really interesting stuff I discover because people point me to it. And the rest is just noise in the background.
I think the AI is probably the biggest change in the music since the early days of Ableton and the revolution.
Yeah, I would say so.
I think there was a 20-year period. I mean, I know that the modules thing got big, but the music sounds didn't really change much. People using Ableton. Yeah. This is really the first big step in over 20 years, or about 20 years now.
Yeah, I think so.
The music can actually really, you'll notice a big difference maybe within 2-3 years. We'll see if it goes that direction. I mean, probably not 2-3 years, but it's going to be by the end of this decade for sure.
Oh, I think 2-3 years. Actually, I would say so.
You say 2-3 years, okay. Whereas everybody can get it and it's really working fluidly and.
I think the problem is not the technology. The problem is really that people need a bit of time to understand what they can do, and with image and video, it took 2-3 years for people to really figure out what the cool stuff is. And now there's a lot of cool stuff out there. So
now back to Monolake, right? And I mean, and also Robert Henke, your other stuff. You've been doing this audiovisual thing for a long time, and I've seen some mind-blowing shows in Tresor Kraftwerk and Berghain. I forgot that theater that you did the thing there, like Tiergarten many years ago, probably 10 years back. I think it had the laser thing, if I remember correctly. It's so while ago. But you've been doing incorporating like the visual thing with the music since the beginning of Monolake, like back in the 90s when you were playing live, or that came later?
It came later. And the history is actually interesting because I was always interested in visual arts, but I never considered that I could do anything like that. It just didn't cross my mind. And there was a time around 2000 maybe, or a bit later, where festivals started to have these AV nights, and where suddenly, as a music act, you were combined with a random VJ. And I had several occasions where I was playing a Monolake show with some assigned VJ. And during the show, I looked back on the projection and I thought, what the heck has this projection to do with my music? Nothing.
I've been there.
And I found this really annoying. And this was also the time where the first really interesting AV acts showed up, like Yoji Ikeda, Carsten Nicolai, and those people who already push the limits of what is possible if you integrate this in a nice way. And I felt that I cannot move on with having a random VJ doing stuff. And then I wrote a little Max program again to do visuals for me, so that I at least, even if it's not technically and artistically state of the art, at least it's my own stuff and at least it's not working against my music. And this was the beginning of doing AV stuff for me. And a bit later, for some completely different reason, I got into working with lasers. That was 2010, maybe. And I was asked to do a piece for a gallery, and I decided I want to work with a laser. And sometimes I'm really naive. I just do things that I believe I could do, even if I have no clue. And then I start to do some research and talk to people, and it turned out that what I wanted to do is complicated and also way too expensive for the small gallery, so this didn't work out. But then I was already hooked on the idea. And then I started to explore what I could do with lasers. And thanks to the CEO of the company who is manufacturing the lasers that I was experimenting with, he got me in contact with a curator from a museum in France, and suddenly I had my first exhibition or my first installation piece with lasers on a big scale. And that happened, ironically, because the guy from this gallery was a Monolake fan. So because he knew my music, he was interested enough to see what I'm doing with lasers. And this is how I came to my first installation. And then after doing this installation, a lot of people ask me, so when are you using lasers for concerts? And I said, it's too expensive, it's too complicated, I can't do that. But of course, it starts, working in your brain. And this was when I started to develop this Lumiere concept, where I synchronized sound and lasers in a really very hard and precise way.
That was a shown at Tiergarten.
Exactly, yeah. And well, that was became a big success, I would say. And I actually plan to do, I did 3 versions of this. And the last version I did in 2016. And I'm a bit tempted to do a 4th version now, with all the ideas I have and now and all the different musical ideas I have 10 years later. So maybe there's something like this coming, maybe at the end of next year, I don't know.
Does the laser technology move forward with what they can do with lasers compared to, let's say, back in the rave days when you'd go and you see the multicolor lasers?
Yes. I mean,
you can do a lot more with it now.
The biggest difference is that there is a lot more manufacturers, and that lasers became much cheaper, much more within reach of people, and there's much more offerings that are affordable, and there's an abundance now of laser software out there. I mean, I wrote my own software back in the days because there was no software that did what I needed to do. And now there's Touch Designer, which does a lot of laser stuff. So if you want to work with lasers, you don't need to write your own software. There's tons of offerings for these kind of things. And this is also why I found it personally more challenging to develop a new work. Because if I do a new laser work, then I want to do something that is a bit more interesting than what everyone else can do. And this cannot be done, in my opinion, with more, because I cannot compete with people who can afford 50 or 100 lasers, and I don't want to. This can only be done with having a great artistic idea.
I mean, me personally, probably the best audio visual show I ever saw was when you did the Robert Henke thing at Kraftwerk at Trésor. I guess that was like 7-8 years ago now. 2017 maybe. Right?
You mean the one with the which one?
The one that there was multiple Robert Henke shows there, or was it...
Well, there were a few different ones. So which one do you mean?
The one that had the huge truss on the top with the
moving
red lights.
balloons.
Yeah.
I mean, this was the collaboration with Christopher Bauder. Yeah. I mean,
this is my bond. That
was insane. Yeah,
it was really insane. And I think you told me the production just to put that in was like crazily expensive.
It's completely non-sustainable. It was something that we could do 2 times, and then.
I've never seen anything that amazing. I mean, I've been at big concerts and big bands. I've never seen anything on that level. It was mind-blowing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Christopher went very, very far in this direction. But the price for that is doing big commercial events. And this is something that is just not my interest. So this idea of doing stuff on a really, really large scale, you basically have 2 options. Either you become a superstar in the art world, where the big museums give you commissions and money doesn't play a role. That happens to a very, 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 very small few people in their lives. Or you do stuff that works on a large scale commercially, stuff that you can also use for a car commercial or for illuminating a building in Dubai, those kind of things. This is where the money is. And if you are not interested in those type of things, and I am not, then you have to do things on a smaller scale. And if you do things on a smaller scale, then you have to focus on the exact thing you do.
Which is now the new the recent Monolake show I saw at RSO a year ago was with
these old computers,
old computers in the video, but you look like some of them were struggling out a little bit when you were playing, right? So that's going to happen, right? Because these things are old and they're beat up and
they are. I mean, we take great care of them, but they are 44 years old now. And of course, sometimes...
Were they that old? I didn't realize that they were, 44 years old.
And the main CPU, the main thing that runs them is from 1975.
Wow, I didn't know that. I thought they were from more the early 80s, I thought they were like the mainframe computers we used to use in high school when they used to show us how to program computers back in the late 80s. So where do you find these things? I mean, I'm sure they're eBay and stuff. How many you have? You must have stockpile.
I have a few spares, but they are, and this is part of the beauty, they are not extremely complex. So you can still open them and understand what's going on. And this is how this project was possible, because we needed to write our own software for it. We needed to build our own network hardware, because they don't have a network, they don't have USB or Ethernet or something like this. So if you want these computers to talk with each other, you have to invent it. So one is running a sequencer, 3 of them are running sound, 1 of them is doing video, and then there's another one which acts as a clock generator. It's kind of an insane project, but I somehow enjoy the luxury that I can do this.
Well, it's kind of complete opposite of what you did at Kraftwerk, right?
Yeah,
because
exactly.
It's like one is this high-tech production that costs them $1 zillion to do, and then you probably get these computers for a few euros, right?
Nowadays, everything is collectible.
Oh, wow.
So these computers are expensive.
Expensive too.
Not inhibitingly expensive, but not for free. The bigger problem is that since they are fragile, we have to transport them in a van, which means if I have a show, let's say in Lithuania, that means 2 drivers drive 3 days in one direction and 3 days in the other direction. So I have to pay 2 people for 6 days just for driving. And that, of course, makes the show expensive. You can't pull this off for €1,000.
And what do you do if you have to go abroad, like if you go to the US or South America?
I can't.
Are you doing shows currently on the Monolake without having to do that?
No. I decided for the album not to tour at all, because I'm busy with Ableton and I want to prepare. First of all, I want to make new music, because I'm really in the mood of making music these days. And then I want to prepare the new laser thing, Lumiere 4. And that's it.
And your new album, you want to give it a little bit of a plug, because it's really good.
No, it's excellent.
It is. What's the name of it again? I forgot the title.
It's called Studio.
They gave it to me, though.
It's Studio.
Oh, it's called Studio.
Like this place here. I think it is... it's really nice, and it is relaxed, and it feels in a good way mature, because I really didn't give a fuck anymore when making it. So I just did what I wanted to do, and I didn't feel under pressure by anyone to show that I can do stuff or to adhere to a style. So it's not techno, it's not electro, it's not anything, it's just me. And I think it sounds great, and I think it has nice grooves, and I really like it.
I mean, I always thought your music was exactly the way you described it.
Yeah, but if I listen to my older stuff, there's some records I really, really love, where I think, wow, this is great. But there's also some records where, especially like something like 10 years ago, where I felt, I kind of tried to change, but I didn't arrive at a new point. And I feel that now I arrived at this new point where I can take elements from the early Monolake and put it in a new context. And I still have the richness and this kind of warmth of the old records, but I have more precision and I have this combined somehow. And I'm very satisfied.
Yeah, I would say that, over the years, in the 20 years, when you really went into the Ableton thing, it was so groundbreaking, in my opinion. I would say in the outs decade, or the noughts, whatever you want to call the 00s, you, in my opinion, were like the Aphex Twin of that era. In production, sound, there was nobody making any music like that. You had a huge inspiration. I know when you say Aphex, people are going to be like, did he really just go there with that? I did actually.
Well,
because for the influence that you've had, and the same for Aphex's industrial stuff in the early 90s on me was massive. And I think in the teen decade, things started going more in this industrial techno direction, and it was a more competitive, harder to stand out at this point for a while everybody's trying to figure out where to go next, right?
But now I feel I know what I'm doing next. And that's a nice feeling.
Yeah. I feel the same. I'm ready to start getting one in the winter time too.
Yeah,
I took a break for a while.
Let's make cool new stuff.
Yeah. Let's do it. Thank you, Robert, for the talk. Always
Adam,
a pleasure to come by and hang out and
hello.
Bye.
Ciao.
Sonic Room Podcast.